When Americans think about World War II, the story often begins in December 1941, with Pearl Harbor and a nation rising in righteous fury. It's a powerful moment, dramatic and unforgettable. But the global war did not wait for America. Long before US troops set foot on European soil, Britain was already fighting for survival alone, battered and bleeding. This is the story history rarely tells clearly. Not to shame America, but to restore balance to the truth. In September 1939, Britain declared war on Nazi Germany after the invasion of Poland. At that moment, the United States stayed neutral. For nearly 2 years, Britain stood as the last major power resisting Hitler in Europe. France fell in weeks. Much of Europe collapsed. Yet Britain did not. That resistance came at an enormous cost. Cities burned. Soldiers died by the tens of thousands. And the nation faced starvation, invasion, and collapse. The Battle of Britain in 1940 was not just an air campaign. It was a fight for existence. Day after day, the Royal Air Force faced the full force of the German Luftwaffe. Britain was outnumbered. Its pilots were young, exhausted, and often flying multiple missions a day. If Britain had lost that battle, there would have been no safe base for American forces later in the war. No D-Day, no liberation of Western Europe. The war's future was decided in British skies before America ever entered the fight. Then came the Blitz. Night after night, German bombs fell on London, Coventry, Liverpool, and dozens of other cities. Civilians slept in subway tunnels. Entire neighborhoods vanished in flames. Yet morale held. Industry continued. Britain kept fighting. This endurance is often reduced to a background chapter in American-centered narratives, but without it, the war would have ended very differently. Even beyond its own survival, Britain fought across the globe. In North Africa, British forces battled Axis troops years before American landings. In the Atlantic, the Royal Navy protected vital supply routes, keeping Britain alive and preparing the ground for the massive US involvement that would follow. When America finally entered the war, it did not start from zero. It joined an ongoing fight one shaped, stabilized, and paid for in blood by Britain. This is not a story about taking credit away from America. American industry, manpower, and sacrifice were decisive. But history shifted the spotlight. Britain's early victories became footnotes, while later American successes became the headline. To understand World War II honestly, we must start where the war was truly held together, by a nation that refused to fall when standing alone. By the time the United States entered World War II in December 1941, the war had already been raging for more than 2 brutal years. During that time, Britain was not just surviving, it was actively fighting and winning critical battles that shaped the future of the conflict. These victories didn't end the war, but they kept it alive long enough for America to join it. Without them, there would have been no platform for US power to land on. One of the most overlooked arenas was the Battle of the Atlantic. From 1939 onward, Britain faced a relentless German U-boat campaign aimed at strangling the island nation into submission. Food, fuel, weapons, everything Britain needed crossed the ocean under constant threat. The Royal Navy, alongside merchant sailors, fought a deadly cat-and-mouse war across thousands of miles of open sea. Losses were horrific. Ships vanished without warning. Crews froze or drowned in dark waters. Yet Britain adapted, innovated convoy systems, and slowly turned the tide before America fully committed its naval strength. In North Africa, British forces were already locked in combat with Axis troops years before American landings. Battles like Operation Compass in 1940 crushed Italian armies and proved the Axis could be beaten on land. Even when German General Erwin Rommel arrived, British troops held him back again and again. These campaigns drained Axis resources, forced Hitler to divert men and equipment, and delayed German plans elsewhere. When American troops finally arrived in North Africa in 1942, they entered a battlefield already shaped by British blood and experience. Britain also fought a global war beyond Europe. In East Africa, British and Commonwealth forces defeated Italian armies, In the Middle East, they secured oil fields vital to the Allied war effort. In Asia, British forces resisted Japanese expansion under extreme conditions, often outmatched and undersupplied. These were not symbolic fights. They were strategic struggles that kept Axis powers overstretched and off balance. Meanwhile, Britain became the industrial and strategic bridge for America. Long before D-Day, British cities hosted American airmen, planners, and engineers. Airfields, ports, radar stations, and command networks were already in place. Britain didn't just fight it, prepared the battlefield for the largest military operation in history. The famous Allied invasion of Europe was launched not from an untouched ally, but from a nation that had been at war since day one. Yet in popular memory, these years are often compressed or skipped. The narrative jumps from British endurance straight to American arrival, as if the ground had always been secure. It wasn't. Britain earned that ground through sacrifice, adaptation, and hard-won victories. America would later bring overwhelming force, but Britain made sure there was still a war left to win. As the war moved deeper into the 1940s, Britain's role quietly shifted from lone defender to the backbone of Allied momentum. Many of the victories that later appeared as dramatic American triumphs were, in reality, built on foundations Britain had already laid through planning, sacrifice, and early success. History remembers the final blow, but often forgets who made that blow possible. Strategic bombing is a clear example. Long before large numbers of American bombers filled the skies over Europe, Britain's Royal Air Force was already carrying the air war to Germany. Night after night, RAF crews flew deep into enemy territory, facing heavy flak and fighter attacks. Loss rates were devastating. Entire bomber crews vanished in a single mission. These early raids forced Germany to divert massive resources into air defense fighter aircraft, anti-aircraft guns, radar systems, and personnel that were desperately needed on the Eastern Front and elsewhere. When American daylight bombing campaigns began, they benefited directly from the pressure Britain had already applied. The same pattern appeared in intelligence warfare. British codebreakers at Bletchley Park achieved one of the most decisive breakthroughs of the entire war by cracking the German Enigma codes. This wasn't a single moment of brilliance, but a sustained, exhausting effort involving mathematicians, linguists, engineers, and analysts working around the clock. The intelligence gained saved countless Allied lives at sea and on land. American forces later relied heavily on this system, but the breakthrough itself was British, achieved years before U.S. entry into the conflict. In the Mediterranean, British operations weakened Axis control long before American attention fully turned there. Campaigns in places like Crete, Malta, and Libya tied down German forces and disrupted supply lines. Malta, in particular, became a fortress under siege. British aircraft and submarines operating from the island devastated Axis convoys, headed for North Africa. This directly contributed to later Allied victories, including those often remembered as American-led successes. Even D-Day, the most iconic moment of American military history, was shaped by British planning. British commanders had been studying amphibious warfare since the disaster at Dunkirk. Hard lessons were learned, analyzed, and applied. British developed landing craft, deception operations, and coastal assault tactics formed the core of the invasion strategy. The beaches were stormed by Americans, Canadians, and British troops alike, but the blueprint was multinational, with Britain playing a central role. None of this diminishes American courage or sacrifice. U.S. soldiers fought fiercely and died in huge numbers, but history's spotlight often lingers on the moment America arrived, not on the years Britain spent preparing the stage. Britain didn't just survive the early. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the battle for memory quietly began. World War II was over, but a new struggle emerged, one over narrative, influence, and global leadership. In this post-war world, America rose as a superpower, and with that rise came a retelling of the war that naturally placed American actions at the center. Britain's earlier victories did not disappear, but they slowly faded into the background. The reasons were not sinister, they were practical. The United States emerged from the war economically powerful, largely untouched at home, and positioned to lead the Western world. Hollywood became the most influential storytelling machine on earth. Films, documentaries, and later television series told the war through an American lens. Audiences saw Normandy, Bastogne, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa again and again. British battles earlier, messier, and often defensive were harder to package as heroic climaxes. Britain, on the other hand, was exhausted. Its economy was shattered. Cities lay in ruins. The empire was collapsing, and survival at home took priority over shaping global memory. Britain did not invest in selling its version of the war. Its veterans went back to work, rebuilt their lives, and rarely demanded recognition. Silence, dignity, and understatement became part of the national identity. But that silence came at a historical cost. The Cold War accelerated this shift. America needed clear symbols of strength and victory to define its role against the Soviet Union. World War II became a foundational myth of American leadership. Britain was still an ally, but now a junior one. Its early stand against Hitler no longer fit the simple narrative of American rescue and triumph. Education played a role too. In US and Canadian classrooms, the war is often taught from the moment America entered it. Earlier years are summarized quickly. The complexity of Britain fighting alone, losing empire while winning battles, doesn't fit neatly into textbooks. Over time, memory compresses. What is taught becomes what is remembered. Yet history does not change simply because the spotlight moves. Britain's victories remain real. The skies over Britain in 1940, the oceans of the Atlantic, the deserts of North Africa, and the intelligence rooms of Bletchley Park all matter deeply. They shaped the war America would later fight and win. Understanding this doesn't weaken American pride. It strengthens historical truth. World War II was not won by one nation alone. It was a relay, not a solo race. Britain ran the opening legs under unimaginable pressure, passed the baton forward, and kept running until the end. When we restore that context, we don't erase American fame, we finally give Britain its due place beside it. History is not only written by victors, it is remembered by storytellers. In the case of World War II, the loudest voices after the war often belonged to those who emerged strongest at the end. America's power shaped the modern world, and with it, the dominant version of the war. But strength at the finish line should never erase sacrifice at the starting point. Britain entered the war first and endured its darkest years alone. It faced invasion, starvation, and collapse, yet refused to surrender. That decision changed everything. Britain's early resistance bought time for industry to mobilize, for alliances to form, and for America to prepare. Those years were not passive waiting. They were filled with hard-won victories, brutal losses, and relentless adaptation. Britain didn't just survive the war's opening chapter, it carried it. When America finally entered the conflict, it brought unmatched industrial power and fresh manpower. Its contribution was decisive, overwhelming, and essential. But it did not arrive to a blank battlefield. It stepped onto ground Britain had already held, defended, and shaped at enormous cost. From airfields and ports to intelligence networks and battle-tested strategies, Britain provided the framework on which American success was built. Canada, too, played a crucial role alongside Britain, training aircrews, protecting Atlantic routes, and fighting across Europe. The Allied victory was a shared achievement, forged through cooperation, not competition. Yet over time, public memory simplified the story. Complex partnerships became single hero narratives. Early endurance faded behind later dominance. Restoring balance does not mean rewriting history. It means widening the lens. The Battle of Britain matters as much as D-Day. The Atlantic convoys matter as much as Normandy beaches. The codebreakers and quiet English estates matter as much as soldiers storming fortified coasts. When these pieces are seen together, the war finally makes sense. For American and Canadian audiences, this perspective adds depth, not discomfort. It shows that victory came from unity, patience, and shared sacrifice. It reminds us that leadership sometimes means holding the line when no one else can. Britain did that when the outcome was far from certain, and the cost was almost unbearable. World War II was not a story of stolen glory. It was a story of exchanged roles. Britain held the torch in the darkness, passed it forward, and kept marching beside its allies until the end. When we acknowledge that truth, history doesn't lose a hero, it gains its full cast. When World War II is remembered through a narrow lens, Canada often fades into the background, mentioned briefly, then overlooked. Yet for Britain and the wider Allied cause, Canada was not a supporting actor, it was a pillar. For American and Canadian audiences, understanding Canada's role reveals how deeply interconnected Allied victory truly was, long before fame and headlines took shape. From the very beginning of the war, Canada stood with Britain. Canadian troops crossed the Atlantic early, at a time when invasion of the British Isles was a real and terrifying possibility. These soldiers did not arrive to victory parades. They arrived to uncertainty training, guarding coastlines, and preparing for battles that might never come, but absolutely could. Their presence alone strengthened Britain's defenses and signaled that Britain was no longer completely alone. In the air, Canada became the training ground of the Allied world. The British Commonwealth Air Training Plan transformed wide Canadian skies into massive classrooms for war. Pilots, navigators, gunners, and engineers trained safely away from enemy attack, then shipped overseas to fight. By war's end, hundreds of thousands of aircrew had passed through Canada. Many of the men flying famous bombing missions over Europe were trained there, shaped by Canadian instructors, on Canadian soil. At sea, Canada's contribution was just as critical. In 1939, the Royal Canadian Navy was small and underprepared. By 1945, it had become one of the largest navies in the world. Canadian ships escorted convoys across the Atlantic, fighting the same deadly U-boat war as Britain. These sailors faced brutal weather, constant danger, and enormous losses. Their work kept Britain supplied and kept the Allied war machine running. On land, Canadian troops proved themselves again and again. At Dieppe in 1942, Canadian forces paid a terrible price in a raid that failed tactically, but revealed vital lessons about amphibious warfare. Those lessons directly shaped the planning of D-Day. Later, Canadian soldiers fought fiercely in Normandy, cleared heavily defended ports, and pushed deep into the Netherlands, where they are remembered to this day as liberators. Yet Canada rarely claimed the spotlight. Like Britain, it emerged from the war focused on rebuilding rather than broadcasting its sacrifices. In American-centered narratives, Canadian victories were often folded quietly into broader Allied success, without clear distinction. But history is richer when told fully. Britain held the line, Canada reinforced it. Together, they created the conditions that allowed American power to arrive and tip the balance. The Allied victory was not sudden, it was constructed step by step, by nations willing to fight before recognition was guaranteed. History is never just about the past. The way World War II is remembered continues to shape how nations see themselves and each other today. When Britain's early victories and Canada's steady contributions fade from public memory, it doesn't only distort the past, it simplifies the lessons the war was meant to teach. One of the most dangerous myths is the idea of instant rescue, the belief that overwhelming power arrives quickly to stop evil. In reality, World War II was nearly lost before it was ever won. Britain's stand-in 1940 and 1941 shows that survival often depends on endurance, not dominance. For American and Canadian audiences, this truth adds weight to the concept of alliances. It reminds us that leadership sometimes means holding the line when success is uncertain and recognition is unlikely. The war also demonstrates how credit influences identity. America's post-war narrative emphasized decisive action and final victory. Britain's emphasized resilience and sacrifice. Canada's often emphasize duty without drama. None of these are wrong, but when one story overwhelms the others, history loses depth. The Allied victory was not a single act of heroism. It was a chain of sacrifices, each one dependent on the last. Modern politics, military planning, and even popular culture still echo these simplified narratives. Films favor clear heroes and climactic endings. Textbooks condense years into pages. Social media turns complex history into slogans. In that process, early victories, the ones that prevent disaster rather than deliver triumph, are the easiest to forget. Remembering Britain's role does not weaken American pride. It strengthens Allied identity. It shows that the democratic world survived its darkest hour because multiple nations acted before it was safe to do so. Britain and Canada fought when the outcome was unclear. America fought when victory became possible. Together, they finished the job. This balanced understanding matters today because the world still faces moments of uncertainty. Crises rarely announce themselves at their most dramatic point. They begin quietly, dangerously, and without guarantee of success. The lesson of Britain's early war years is that resistance, even when isolated, can change the future. World War II was not won by a single nation stepping in at the last moment. It was preserved by those who refused to fall at the beginning. When we remember that, history becomes more than a celebration of power. It becomes a guide one that honors patience, cooperation, and the courage to stand first. In the end, World War II cannot be understood by looking only at the moment of victory. It must be understood by tracing the full journey from the first desperate stand to the final surrender. When we do that, the picture becomes clearer and more honest. Britain did not wait for history to favor it. Britain acted when defeat seemed likely and survival was uncertain. The early years of the war were not glamorous. There were no victory parades, no clear turning points, no guarantees. Britain fought while outnumbered, bombed, and isolated. It fought knowing that failure would not simply mean loss, it would mean occupation, destruction, and the end of democratic resistance in Europe. That pressure forged decisions that shaped the entire war. Canada stood shoulder to shoulder with Britain during those years, expanding its military, guarding supply lines, and preparing the air crews who would later fill Allied skies. Together, they preserved the fight long enough for America to enter with its full strength. That moment, America's arrival was decisive. But it was decisive because the war had been held together, not allowed to collapse. For American audiences, this perspective does not take anything away. Instead, it adds meaning. It shows that US power did not emerge in isolation. It joined an alliance already tested by fire. America did not inherit a war, it entered one that had been shaped by sacrifice and resolve. For Canadian audiences, it restores visibility to a nation that did more than its size suggested and asked for less recognition than it deserved. Canada's contribution was not loud, but it was essential. The same can be said for Britain's early victories. They were defensive, costly, and often incomplete, but they were enough. History's credit swap happened quietly. Fame followed the final push, not the first stand. But when we tell the full story, we see that victory is rarely owned by one nation alone. It is built over time by different hands, under different conditions. World War II was a shared achievement. Britain held the door. Canada reinforced the frame. America pushed through with overwhelming force. Remove any one of those roles, and the outcome changes. That is the truth behind the triumph. And when history is told that way, it doesn't divide allies, it unites them. With respect earned, not reassigned. Every generation inherits World War II not through experience, but through memory. That memory is shaped by stories we repeat, images we replay, and heroes we choose to highlight. Over time, repetition becomes truth, at least in the public mind. This is how Britain's early victories slowly slipped into the background while America's later triumphs took center stage. Legacy is not built only on what happened, but on what is remembered. For decades, memorials, movies, and anniversaries focused on the dramatic turning points of the war's final years. Those moments mattered deeply, but they were made possible by quieter, earlier acts of resistance, acts that lacked spectacle but carried enormous risk. Britain's decision to fight on in 1940 was one of those acts. It did not guarantee victory, it merely kept hope alive. For Britain, honoring that legacy was never about claiming ownership of victory. It was about acknowledging cost. Tens of thousands of civilians killed in bombings. A generation shaped by rationing, loss, and constant fear. Soldiers sent across the world to fight battles history barely remembers. These were not steps toward fame. They were steps toward survival. Canada's legacy followed a similar path. Canadians fought and died far from home, often under British command, rarely demanding recognition. In places like Normandy and the Netherlands, their actions are remembered locally with gratitude, but globally, they are often absorbed into a broader Allied label. That humility became part of Canada's national character, but it also made its sacrifices easier to overlook. America's legacy, by contrast, was shaped by scale and timing. When the United States entered the war, it did so with unmatched resources and clarity of purpose. Its victories were visible, decisive, and final. These are the moments history loves most. They fit neatly into stories of triumph and resolution. Fame followed naturally, but honoring one legacy should never require erasing another. World War II teaches that victory is layered. Some nations fight first, some endure longest, some strike hardest at the end. Each role matters. When we honor only the final blow, we misunderstand the struggle that made it possible. Today, as the last veterans fade from living memory, responsibility shifts to storytellers, educators, and audiences. What version of the war will be passed on? One that celebrates power alone, or one that respects endurance, cooperation, and shared sacrifice? Britain's early wins, Canada's steady strength, and America's decisive force together form the full legacy of Allied victory. Remembered that way, World War II becomes not a tale of borrowed glory, but a lesson in unity earned over time under fire, by nations willing to stand together when it mattered most. World War II deserves to be remembered in full, not in fragments shaped by fame or timing. When the story is told honestly, it becomes clear that victory was not sudden, simple, or owned by one nation. It was built slowly, painfully by allies who played different roles at different moments, each essential to the final outcome. Britain's role was to stand first. In the darkest hours, when defeat seemed likely and help uncertain, Britain refused to fall. That refusal mattered more than any single battle. It preserved a foothold for democracy in Europe and kept the war from ending before it truly began. The skies over Britain, the convoys of the Atlantic, the deserts of North Africa, and the quiet rooms of intelligence work were not side stories. They were the foundation. Canada's role was to reinforce and sustain. It trained air crews, guarded lifelines, expanded its forces, and fought with determination for from home. Canada proved that commitment is not measured by population size or loudness, but by consistency and sacrifice. Its contribution strengthened Britain and prepared the way for the massive Allied operations that followed. America's role was to finish the fight. When the United States entered the war, it brought clarity, momentum, and overwhelming power. American industry turned the tide. American soldiers fought with courage, and American leadership helped drive the Allies to final victory. That achievement deserves respect, and it shines even brighter when placed in the full context of what came before. History's credit swap did not happen because of dishonesty. It happened because stories favor conclusions over beginnings. They celebrate the final charge more than the long defense. But when we restore balance, we don't diminish anyone. We honor everyone. For American and Canadian audiences today, this understanding strengthens shared identity. It reminds us that alliances succeed when nations act before recognition is guaranteed. It shows that leadership sometimes means standing alone and sometimes means arriving in force. Both are necessary. As time moves on and living memory fades, accuracy becomes a responsibility. World War II was not a tale of borrowed glory. It was a shared journey, one that demanded endurance, patience, cooperation, and sacrifice from many nations across many years. Britain held the line. Canada reinforced it. America broke through. Together, they secured victory.